Today, we are going to be going over 10 books that can and possibly will change your life if you choose to read them. Before we get into things, if you wouldn't mind subscribing to our channel and tossing a thumbs up on this video, that would be greatly appreciated. Let's get started. First off, we have Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. So this is a book on Stoicism and philosophy. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor, one of the most powerful Roman emperors, and also known for bringing peace to the Roman Empire during his reign. He talks a lot about the dichotomy of control, so not letting external events that we have no control over disturb us, but rather to take the things that we do have control over, like how we react to events, and focusing on those instead, and focusing on having positive reactions to things, or at least looking at obstacles as they arise as things that we can use for self-improvement. That if somebody places an obstacle in your way, you shouldn't get upset that that has been done, but rather just focus on being the type of person that can get over said obstacles. And then my favorite quote from this novel would be, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment." You have complete control of your perspective, and your perspective is what drives your emotions. So if you are in a terrible emotional state, if you have poor mental health, it is probably due to the perspective you are taking on things rather than the things themselves. Moving on here to the second book, we've got The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung. So Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist. He is largely attributed with the founding of psychoanalysis. A lot of modern psychology is based on Carl Jung's findings. The two schools of thoughts tend to go between more of a Freudian view, which is that our mind is simply mechanical and everything operates very rigidly. Carl Jung was much different. Rigidly, Carl had a much more religious and kind of spiritual idea about how the mind and conscious works, especially with his concepts on the collective unconscious. In this book, Carl Jung it tries to really talk about how collectives and groups will infringe on people's abilities to become unique individuals, and also goes deep into the dangers of mass movements. So about how groupthink starts to take over, and how any level of consciousness that the individual has ends up usually getting stamped out, and they more or less just become kind of zombies to a movement, and also talks about the threat that, say, organized religion has imposed upon the individual, as well as the growth of mass governments. He also touches on the search for meaning for the individual, and how a lot of the times that's where they lose themselves in mass movements, as that's where they find meaning and purpose in their life. But he thought that individuals should seek to become much more unique and to discover their inner world rather than losing themselves in the exterior world. My favorite quote from this book is, "Rational argument can be conducted with some prospect of success only so long as the emotionality of a given situation does not exceed a certain critical degree." I think that's a very important quote. You can use it on a social scale or within your personal relationships as well, that once things have gotten to a certain point emotionally, it's best to just step back and re-engage once those emotions have calmed down. Obviously, on a social scale, you can't do that as well, but in our personal lives, we should definitely seek to take a breather a little bit more here and there. Third book is Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche is a German philosopher from the 1800s. I don't think people realize how much of his thinking has led the world to become the way that it is. He was a foundational thinker for the principles of postmodernism, which is a philosophy that is largely taken over the world. Then also a lot of fascists actually pulled off their dictatorships and the underlying ideas for their dictatorships through his concept of the will to power. However, what he sought to do in this book was give people a framework for finding meaning and purpose in their lives in a world that would be largely characterized by nihilism. Favorite quote from this book is, "One must be a sea to receive a polluted stream without becoming impure," meaning that individuals would have to have a great and cultivated sense of self in order to not lose themselves in the groups. There's a great idea of Nietzsche's as well, that madness is not very common in individuals, but in groups, mobs, and political parties, it's the rule. So he thought that individuals would have to have a great sense of self in order to not lose themselves in the collective. Moving on here to my fourth book. This is the only book on the list that I have as an audiobook, and there's a specific reason for that. It's David Goggins' Cant Hurt Me. The book itself is great as well, but however, I would suggest anybody who wants to look into this book to download the audiobook version, because in between chapters, the guy that helped David Goggins write this book and him have a kind of podcast-ish conversation about the chapters and break them down in further detail. But David Goggins, for anybody who doesn't know, is a Navy SEAL who is known for being one of the hardest men on the planet. He is a frequent ultramarathon runner. He went through Hell Week more times than anyone, I believe. That's the Navy SEAL training program. This guy runs ultramarathons like 100 miles like weekly. He's shot out both of his knees from doing so, yet continues to run on them. Doctors have looked at his knees and said somebody like you shouldn't even be able to walk, let alone run marathons. And so Goggins' whole concept is that the mind acts as a limiter on the body, and that we as humans are capable of so much more than we give ourselves credit for. The book goes through the 40% rule is one of his famous concepts that comes up in this book, which is that humans quit at 40% difficulty, and most people never actually push themselves beyond that internal limiter, but that they would be shocked to find out how deep they can really go. My favorite quote from this book is, "You are in danger of living a life so comfortable and soft that you will die without ever realizing your true potential." Number 5 on the list is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. So this is a dystopian society novel. It's the only fiction book in this list. Huxley envisioned a world where an authoritarian government took control of everybody by inundating them with pleasure and distractions. So this is the whole bread and circuses concept that the Romans used quite a lot, where as long as you keep the masses, the general citizenry essentially sedated, they will never push back against your rule. Even if you don't want to go as deeply as looking at that on a societal level as to how, say, certain authoritarian regimes could operate, I think it is very insightful into how pleasure can become a negative consequence in our life. For instance, in this book, the citizens of Brave New World ended up reaching for things like Soma every time, which is a pill that they would take anytime they felt any level of discomfort. In this world, they were taught not to really feel love, promotion of promiscuity, etc. And I think there's a lot of parallels to modern society with this, where we don't, and again, whether you want to get into whether it's a strategy or whether it's something we've fallen into on our own will or lack of will thereof, I think a lot of people lose meaning and purpose in their lives. They fail to become the person they're capable of being simply because they are constantly inundating themselves with pleasure and, say, sitting in front of TV endlessly. My favorite quote from this novel is, "That is the secret of happiness and virtue, liking what you've got to do. And all societal conditioning aims at that, making people like their unescapable social destiny." Moving on here to the 6th book is The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. This is a famous novel, very well read, and it's a very easy philosophy book to pick up for your first time. The 4 Agreements that Don Miguel Ruiz says that we should all adhere to, and this is a personal agreement thing that we should take essentially a contract with ourselves, is be impeccable with your word, meaning be very articulate. This is something that I've actually tried to consciously work on since reading this book, is understanding that our world and even the way that we feel, like let's say you're in a personal relationship and you want to connect with somebody a little bit deeper, that largely depends on your ability to communicate how you see things. So the better you can communicate, the more likely you are to be understood by those around you, and that's actually a very powerful thing, whether it's in personal relationships or business or so on. The other agreement is don't take anything personally. And this is so true, is that most people are just projecting their inner world onto the outer world around them. So it's very easy for you to, let's say somebody treats you poorly, whether it be a stranger or somebody at work or whatever. It's very easy to get into your head about that and go, oh, what could I have done differently? Or am I a piece of shit? In reality, those people are just projecting their own inner turmoil onto you. Third is don't make assumptions, so that we shouldn't assume things are the way they are. Let's say we shouldn't assume XYZ person thinks this thing about us or this thing about the world. Instead, we should look a little bit deeper and try to figure out the actual truth and not to take assumptions as truth. A great idea is that where ambiguity exists, assumptions are made. And I think that if something is ambiguous, to not form concrete conclusions on them. The last agreement is always do your best. So no matter what you are doing, you should do it at 100% effort. And I think this is something that most people fail to do. Again, going back to that David Goggins book, most people quit at 40%. So giving 100% of effort into something is extremely valuable, and very little people ever do it. My favorite quote from this book is, wherever you go, you will find people lying to you. And as your awareness grows, you will notice that you also lie to yourself. Do not expect people to tell you the truth, because they also lie to themselves. The seventh book on the list here is Endurance by Alfred Lansing. So this recounts a famous story of Ernest Shackleton, an explorer from the early 19th century, and this is about their Antarctic expedition from 1914 to 1917. One of those books that makes you really question again what humans are capable of. Shackleton and his crew ended up living in the Arctic for somewhere around roughly a year or so. I think where this can really change people's lives is if they read it through the lens of what it means to be a leader. Ernest Shackleton was among the best leaders in human history. He understood that every single person within his organization had different strengths and weaknesses, and didn't try to hold everybody to the exact same universal standard. So for instance, there was even one guy in the crew which he could tell was a little bit more bitter, that wanted to have a say in things. So he would recruit him as a confidant and somebody to give advice on the plans that they were going to enact, just understanding that that was what was necessary to stop this guy from lashing out. Even if his plans weren't good, Ernest Shackleton made him feel like he was heard and respected. He took this approach with every individual in the group. My favorite quote of this novel was, "Of all their enemies, the cold, the ice, and the sea, he feared none more than demoralization." He understood very well that a lack of belief, a lack of hope was the biggest threat that they faced, and he did everything he could to stave that off. The eighth book on the list is a very famous and popular book, The 48 Laws of Power. It is often thought of as a kind of immoral book. It can very well be a guide to manipulate others. I think this book has even been banned in prisons for that reason. But there's two ways you can read it. You can read it as a guidebook for how to seize power, or you can read it as a warning of how others seize power. That being said, there's good rules that everybody should adhere to in this book, such as assume formlessness, making sure that you're adaptable to the scenarios around you. Another good rule is avoid unhappy people, not allowing yourself to become, say, depressed or upset because everyone else around you is depressed or upset, then there is bad rules in there as well, like learn how to keep people dependent on you or keep others in suspended terror by cultivating an air of unpredictability, and also like do not commit to anybody. Do not ever lock yourself into a relationship, whether that be business-wise or personal. My favorite quote from that book, though, is, "When you show yourself to the world and display your talents, you naturally stir all kinds of resentment, envy, and other manifestations of insecurity. You cannot spend your whole life worrying about the petty feelings of others." I agree with that wholeheartedly. Go about your life and don't concern yourself with the judgments of petty people. The 9th book on the list here is Lying by Sam Harris. This is a very short read. It's actually more aptly described as an essay than a book, but this is an introduction to the ethics of lying. Essentially, Sam Harris tries to make the case that there is under no circumstances a scenario where we should lie, that it is moral to do so. If you're in a physically vulnerable position, maybe lying is your only option, but that is not necessarily good, that there is still always consequences to lies. And also, I think one of the best things that he says in this book is how anytime you lie within your personal relationships, whether that be with a girlfriend or wife or with friends, you're actually undermining that entire relationship itself. You're robbing the people that you supposedly care about of the ability to discern for themselves how to act in the face of truth. You're essentially manipulating anybody, even if you think it's just a white lie. And the last book on the list is The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr. He breaks down how our brains are not logic processors. We don't think in terms of facts like many people would like us to believe. We actually construct our reality off of stories and narratives. He also talks about how the underpinning of a good character in a book is having flaws. So to understand that for you as an individual to be interesting, you also have to have flaws, and that at the heart of every story is change. Every story that we get gripped by is problem, action, result. We like to see those problems being solved and positive changes occurring. My favorite quote from this book would be, "We experience our day-to-day lives in story mode. The brain creates a world for us to live in and populates it with allies and villains. It turns the chaos and bleakness of reality into a simple, hopeful tale, and at the center it places its star, wonderful, precious me, who it sets on a series of goals that become the plots of our lives." There's 10 books that if you are looking to get into a reading journey, or maybe you're just looking for some new books to pick up, these are great starting points. Again, some of them are a little bit more advanced, like Thus Spoke Zarathustra and Carl Jung's The Undiscovered Self. Some of them are a little bit more approachable, like The Four Agreements or Lying by Sam Harris. However, figure out where you would like to start. All of these are a great place. Let me know in the comments below, should we go into a deep dive on any single one of these books, or also is there a book you think should have made it on this list, and maybe I'll read it next. Thank you for watching, and also don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and we'll catch you next time.